Hey, y'all need a break? Listen to these stories from r/AskReddit, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Redditors who have worked around death/burial, what's your best ghost story? I used to be a security guard at a hospital. One night, while doing my rounds, I went into the surgery wing and was walking down a hallway when I saw a doctor looking at the whiteboard where all the scheduled surgeries are written down. I said, "Hello doctor," and kept going. The doctor didn't say anything back, just kept studying the whiteboard. When I got back to the security office, I was telling one of the guys that's been there for years about how I greeted this doctor and he didn't say anything back. I asked if that's the asshole they told me to watch out for. I was asked where I saw him and I said the surgery ward, and he gave me a smirk. He then explained that the surgery ward closes at 9 p.m. and that all patients are moved into the monitoring wards. There should be no one there. He then asked me if this doctor was studying the schedule board. I said yes, and he then told me that I just met Dr. Louis City. Apparently, some many years ago, one of the surgeons went up to the helipad and jumped off the building. Seems like he never stopped working though. I worked within hospice and long-term care. The spookiest phenomenon was the man in the corner. It happens all the time for people actively dying. They see a shadowy man in the corner of their room. My grandfather was extremely sick in the days leading up to his death. He'd worked with asbestos for all his working life and had an extremely debilitating form as a result of it. He couldn't speak, and he hadn't spoken for a month leading up to his death. He couldn't even communicate. On the day of his death, he looked at my mother and said, "The angel is back." My mother was stunned. She asked what he meant, and he said, "The angel is back, and this time he wants me to come with him." My mother looked at the corner of the room where he was looking, turned back to him, and said, "Dad, there's nobody there." He didn't respond. He died that night. That was 20 years ago, and my mother never spoke of it again. She told me the story when I was old enough, just like she told my brothers, but my sister never got to the age where she was old enough. She succumbed to her disease when she was 7, after battling it her entire life. And on the days leading up to her death, she kept speaking about this butterfly who would visit her. My brothers and I would sit with her and nod along. We kind of just thought she'd develop this imaginary friend to help her through what she was struggling with. One day, she shot up, and told us, "The butterfly is back, and he wants me to follow him." I saw my mother's face drop. She'd made the decision not to tell my sister she was dying, and my sister just believed she was going through a rough patch like she often did, not that the doctors had told my mother it was terminal. But my sister said, in the next second, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" That's what the butterfly said. "He told me I'm going to die." My mother admitted to her that, yes, she was going to die. She said, "Oh. Okay." Then laid down, and died, with my brothers, my mom and I cuddling her in bed. I don't know what I believe about the afterlife, but I have to think there must be one. That there's some truth behind the legend of the Grim Reaper, that at some point, something comes to lead all of us away from life. Because otherwise, I have no way of coming to terms with what I've experienced. Not me, but a colleague found a dead person in a dark smoke-filled burned-out building during the mop-up of firefighting operations. As unfortunately happens sometimes, you find them by stepping on them. If they're still intact, you kinda bounce off them. If they're fried, you can often crunch them up pretty bad under your heavy boot. Well, this guy stood right on a badly burned corpse's sternum. Crunch, right into the chest cavity. When he tried to pull his foot out, it got stuck on the ribs and the body came up at him. Burned up arms flailing about. Took him a few tries with what looked like a zombie stuck on his leg. He needed quite a bit of counseling, poor dude. I have several stories from when I worked as a mortuary transport tech. The job was basically transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time though, I had an experience I've never forgotten. I was dropping someone off at the science donation place. This is when you donate your body to science and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all my stuff I had to do in there. I placed him on the board, got the lift out, and placed him on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape type thing. And you could definitely tell what was inside. Legs, hands, feet, etc. Kind of interesting to me at the time. Anyway, I shut the freezer and locked it back up, and started wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was a big L shape, with the freezer off to the larger long portion, and then you turn the corner and there's desks and filing cabinets and whatnot. I about had a heart attack as I turned the corner and there is just this guy standing there examining files in the file cabinet. Looked just like you or me. Dressed modernly, but out of place for what people normally wear back there. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all, or even knew I was there. I should mention this was also about 1 a.m., and I'd never seen anyone at the place this late. So I said, "Well, sorry if I startled you or anything," and went on about my finishing up stuff. Got the gurney back in the van, closed and locked the large garage door from the inside. All the while this guy is just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him that's where I'd be going and I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he's deaf and couldn't hear me. So I went to the bathroom, and came back to the garage, and the guy is gone but the file cabinet is still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced that I was going to be leaving and locking up to set the alarm. No response. And that's what I did, and left. I'm not sure who he was, or is, or what happened. But it was definitely an odd experience and one I still remember perfectly. I have a few other memories about my time at the job, if anyone else wants to hear. Nothing like what happened above though. I have a million that are more grotesque and gory than this one, but it stands out to me. I was once working at a mortuary and had to go pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get a receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all of the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double-checking the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos in similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey OP, how's it going? Ah, holy crap, that guy looks like you." It's the only case I've had nightmares about. I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening me up. In mortuary school I had a dream about embalming my dad, but he was still alive. My classmates tried to tell me it was just tissue gas and he wasn't actually alive, and get my crap together. Then when I cut him open, he gasped a faint "help me." So then the next day I had to go to lab, my second case ever, and I'd told my classmates about the dream. We had a chuckle about it and started to work on our body. Old lady. Had pretty severe arthritis, so when I was breaking the rigor she literally clutched my hand. It's the only time I ever got some serious heebie-effing-jeebies. I had to step away from her and collect myself for a minute lol. During my apprenticeship, I worked at a funeral home said to be haunted by an old funeral director assistant who had a heart attack in the building and died. All he ever did was mess with the chapel lights, and if you called him out, something like, "John, the family is coming, please don't," they would return to normal. Not really sure if I believe it was really haunted, but saying something always fixed the issue, so I kept doing it my entire time there. Not a funeral home, but I worked at one of the last booth homes for pregnant girls in the early 2000s. Lots of dead babies and some dead moms in the history of that campus. We had any number of creepy things happen, to the point that I brought it up in a staff meeting and the social workers just said, "Oh, must be time to have the building blessed again." But what stuck with me was the baby swing. I came into the living room and found it swinging by itself hours after all the teenagers were in bed. Now, this was an ancient mechanical wind-up swing. You had to turn a crank to start it. There was no electricity involved. There was no way it just started on its own. And there it was, swinging full force. I was completely terrified, but I just said, "If you want to swing, I will be happy to wind up the swing for you. But when you do it on your own, it frightens people." Every night for the rest of the year or so I worked there, I wound that swing up and let it go. I told other staff members and I believe they did the same. I like to think it was a sweet baby ghost who just wanted attention, and we gave it attention. Later they closed the program for parenting teens and made the whole place a homeless shelter. Now I am sitting here worrying about my ghost baby. Is it lonely? I hope not. I love stories of people talking to ghosts. My childhood home was haunted and the door to my grandparents' living room would crack open very slightly on its own. My granddad would always say something like, "Come on in and sit down, mate," and the door would open further and my grandma would yell at him. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. One night I was mopping the dining room, which had huge windows overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m., so pitch black outside and low lighting inside. I had this horrible feeling of being watched, so looked up, and reflected in the window was a man behind me. He had a brown suit in, a bowler hat and the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around there was obviously no one there, but I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that and they'd all seen the same man. He just enjoyed terrorizing people. I used to be a driver for a funeral home corporation. Like, drive the hearse and pick up the bodies. Never had anything creepy happen, a few funny things, a few traumatic things. In general, it was a chill job. However, I did get incredibly uncomfortable one night picking up a man who died at home. He still had the defibrillator leads on his chest and his eyes were closed, which is unusual because the eyes are always open. He just looked like he was asleep or unconscious. Not rigid or pale or anything. I just had this sinking feeling for about half an hour in traffic that he was going to suddenly gasp and wake up in the body bag. Then it hit me. That would be the coolest thing ever. I'd take him home and he'd be back with his family. So I just kind of drove slowly and turned up some music and sang along and talked to him. When I got him to the funeral home, I left him out of the cooler for about an hour while I did paperwork and played on my phone. When I got another call, I checked on him and his limbs had started to stiffen. I was kind of bummed. I put him in the cooler and went on my next call. I used to work on an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a good few weeks died early one morning. Last offices had already been done by the night staff and the patient moved to the hospital morgue, so all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was mentoring at the time to do this whilst I got on with the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after, a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room white as a sheet and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me she had been clearing out sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward she would not go near that side room. My grandfather died a while back. One day me and a bunch of my cousins were playing in the front yard, rural area, since on weekends all the family likes to hang out together. So we're out having fun and see Lolo, grandfather, walking towards the house. We all greet him and he smiles at us. He walks up the porch into the house and hangs his hat by the door. We continue playing until we hear crying from the inside of the house and my uncle driving fast up the driveway. We all rush in to see what's going on and see everybody bunched up in the kitchen crying, telling us that Lolo died early that morning and they just found out. He lives a few towns away. We looked at each other and told the grown-ups, "Nah, we just saw him come into the house." They didn't believe us and we told them that he really did not that long ago and he even hung up his hat by the door. So everybody rushes to the door and his hat was hanging right where we said it was. He doesn't ever go anywhere without that hat. So me and my cousins are running all over the house calling for him while our parents are so quiet and freaking out. He actually did die earlier that morning and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in their house. We left the hat where it was and nobody ever touched it. When my cousin was 18 he was in a bad wreck, and him, his girlfriend and her sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" The funeral director said it was the first time he ever had to go home and change pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital. The same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state. But a few weeks later he walked out of the hospital. My aunt said it was the worst and best day of her life. I used to be a nurse assistant on a cancer floor that also served as the hospice floor. The number of times a patient would pass and be removed from a room, only to have that room's call light continue to go off without anyone inside was just nuts. And before you say maybe the light was just damaged or moved strangely in the process of removing the body, that's the only time it would happen. Broken call lights, in any other circumstance, just wouldn't come on at all. Mom told me stories when I was growing up. Her first job out of nursing school was a registered nurse in the ER of an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There was the man in the hat and patient one. Most of the nurses had stories about them. The man in the hat would show up and stand outside of rooms after visiting hours. The patients often died soon after. Patient one was a woman in a very old hospital gown. She'd walk in the halls before entering random rooms. Those patients usually coded. They took the man to be an omen of death and the woman to be a heads up to grab the crash cart. I am an ICU registered nurse. We had a septic patient in the unit. She was 29 weeks pregnant. She went into labor on my shift and we delivered her baby, stillborn. I did post-mortem care on the baby, retrieved the proper transport container and walked the baby down to the morgue. It was the middle of the night, I'm in an elevator alone. I hear a baby start wailing. I absolutely lose my crap and rip open the cover, and just as I go to zip down the bag, I hear a calming male voice say, "Hush little one, I've got you, no need to cry." The crying stopped immediately. Shaking, I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see, a deceased 29-week-old baby. I am a big bearded 40-year-old ICU nurse, and that was the scariest crap I've ever experienced. No one believes me to this day. I don't even want to speculate what the crying or the voice was. God. Even typing that out I felt my chest tightening. I was a registered nurse and was working in a very well-off town in Mississippi. The hospital had 2 ICUs, with the second one being an overflow type unit on the 3rd floor. There were 7 rooms in that unit and room 2 was haunted. Numerous times different nurses watched something walk into the room, but the room would be empty without a patient in it. One time a nurse had an actual patient in room 2. It was about 4 a.m. and the nurse was going to do a dressing change. She took the stuff into the room and the patient asked what she was going to do. She said, "Change your dressings." The patient said, "Oh no, that other nurse was just in here about 30 minutes ago and did it." The nurse looked, and yes, the dressing was fresh. She went out to the desk and told the one other nurse, "Thanks for doing that." The nurse was baffled and said, "I didn't change the dressing." They both freaked out a bit. Rumor has it that an RN that had worked for the hospital a long time died in that room. The hospital is now a dorm for a big college, so fun times may be had by a bunch of college students. Junior doctor on the wards, doing a night shift, called to verify a death. Enter the private bay. It's all a bit grim, slightly gloomy room. Patient is lying there, old man, looks peaceful. Start my checks, stethoscope out, no signs of active respiration. No heart sounds. Rub the sternum for a response. None. Time to get closer and check the CNS for any signs of life. I lift the eyelids up, reach for my pen torch, balancing closer to the patient. That's when it happens. The patient lurches forward, his face now inches away from mine. I scream. Nurses rush in and ask what's happened. "What was that noise? Why so pale? You look like you've seen a ghost." That's when I realize. I leant in too close and my leg brushed against the bed controls, raising the bed. Nurses couldn't stop laughing as they offered to make me a cup of tea. Thanks for watching. Do you have any similar stories to share? Don't be shy and drop them in the comments below, then like and subscribe for more Reddit videos.